What's up, everyone? I'm Giovanni Bristow, and this is the Media Mogul News Hour. Thank you, everyone, for tuning back in again. I appreciate it. And today I'm here with political and policy specialist, Lee Spieckerman. How are you doing?
Great to be with you. I'm terrific. Thank you.
Wonderful. Listen, we had our lovely crackerjack of errors that occurred just a little bit early, but that's all right. We made it here. So, look, and over the last, I think it's been over a year since we, were on camera together. A lot's
Yeah.
happened.
What took you so long? It's been a minute since we did this.
I know. Yeah, I'll try to not make it be as long. So, look, what all has happened? We're like year 2 into a pandemic. January 6th occurred. Our lovely Capitol event that happened. What else? I've become independent. I think that I'm now close to a year of not being affiliated with the party. Did I miss anything in that list?
Well, I think your thing about being an independent, and I've tweeted this. Anyone that wants to follow me, they can at Spieckerman, which is just at the @ sign in my difficult to spell last name, Spieckerman.
I've dealt with
It's
worse.
too bad you can't cut and paste from my podcast, but I guess they can from when you post it. But I've tweeted several times that George Washington and other of our founders believed that political parties were a scourge. And in his final message to the nation, President Washington said that he hoped that we would never devolve into having political parties. But what did George Washington know? He was only the father of our country.
Right.
And what have we seen? I mean, parties have contributed to tribalism, to dysfunction. They both of them. I mean, there are great people in both parties. There are very smart people. There are patriots in the leadership and visibly in the public eye in both parties and in holding office in both parties. Certainly not all of them. If you follow me on Twitter or my commentary, you'll see that I pretty much I'm even-handed in my criticism of people from both parties and in my praise.
Yes.
And one thing I
yes, you
noticed
have.
that I'm comfortable doing that I just very rarely see is I will criticize somebody and then a day later or maybe even the same day I'll compliment them. I'm not doing that to be nice or to be fair. It may be, or what it means is what I criticized them for I thought was a mistake.
It was deserving at the time.
What I praised them for I thought was smart or clever or innovative or whatever. And what parties have really calcified in our country is this idea
nice choice
that it's
of words.
all or nothing. Everything the Republicans want to do is fascism, is turning the clock back, ruining our democracy, whatever, and everything that the Democrats want to do is socialism, weak America. America's not exceptional.
Destroying the country, right?
And that mantra, those talking points just are repeated incessantly, not only by office holders, but of course the partisan cable TV networks. Fox News, if you watch it, and I used to be on Fox, I was banned for criticizing Tucker Carlson in a video.
Hey, I didn't know that.
I praised him too. He's an example, but I hardly criticized him.
I learned something today.
A lot of his handling of racial issues. But the point is that Fox News is a wonderful operation, has some of the best news people of any outlet, whether it's web, print, television, whatever. But if you watch the opinion shows at night, they say it's the same thing over and over again, repeated in somewhat different ways. It's demonizing the Democrats. It's lampooning and maligning President Biden. Then you go over to CNN and MSNBC, and of course, it's the inverse. It's the mirror image of that. They're tearing down Mitch McConnell, or they're tearing down Ron DeSantis, or whatever Republican happens to be in the news. Maybe it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. In that case, it's well deserved. But both parties have their outliers and their extremists that routinely say and do things that are abhorrent. But the problem is, you will never see CNN or MSNBC criticize Ilhan, to any degree that I've ever witnessed, Ilhan Omar, or some of these other folks that are on the fringe of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And of course, on Fox News, you hear little or no criticism of the Marjorie Taylor Greenes or folks like that. So, I think parties have, and of course, voting, it's even worse. I mean, when it comes to voting for bills, unless the bill is under the radar and not very controversial. And by the way, the only way a bill isn't controversial is if it's under the radar. Because if you take any bill that is pushed by either party or by a bipartisan group of lawmakers and put the spotlight on it, if for whatever reason Fox News or CNN or MSNBC decided to take that bill and talk about it, it would immediately become anathema to one or both parties, and it would probably be withdrawn. So the only legislation that gets passed virtually is non-controversial bills, which is to say bills that are under the radar. And the two great successes, legislative successes that President Biden has had are the Rescue Act, the stimulus, which should have been passed by Trump before the election. He might have won re-election, but anyway, it was basically a version of that, a different iteration of what should have been the Trump stimulus, and the infrastructure bill. Those are the two biggies. The Build Back Better, the huge bill with all the social spending and the green energy initiatives and all of that. Of course, that's stalled because of Manchin and Sinema. But the problem is, we are one country with a common set of problems. Now, we don't agree on all the problems. Obviously, there's some things that people on the left think are problems that most folks on the right don't think are problems, vice versa.
Right.
But we agree on a lot of the problems. The problem is, you are not allowed to even listen to or discuss solutions that come from the other side. And if there's one thing I learned in business, and I spent most of my career in business, you can't have the equivalent of partisanship. In fact, people that go in with one way of thinking and always criticizing and always, looking askance at certain people that have ideas in meetings or in memos or whatever, they are generally separated from the organization. They can't play well with others.
Right.
Because business is about solutions. And it doesn't mean you don't have principles. It doesn't mean you don't have a mission that guides what you do, and you don't want to get too far.
That is the sole purpose as to why I left partisan politics.
It doesn't matter if the idea makes sense. If it comes from a Democrat, the Republicans hate it. It means it's socialism. It means it's weakening America. If the Republicans come up with it, it's to help the rich people. It's to put down minorities. It's to build up the military or whatever. Now, again, on both sides, sometimes that criticism is accurate, but not on every single thing.
Right.
And that's so. I'm sorry for the long dissertation when you brought up being independent, but the point is, I lean Republican. I'm pro-business. I'm pro-defense, and so I guess that makes me lean Republican. But I think the Republicans are utterly, with few exceptions, mainly the few black people that are prominent in the Republican Party, like Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who's one of my favorites. They are clueless on race. They are in a fantasy land, and they are also clueless on, for the most part, on trade. They've lapped up this drivel dished out by Wall Street and they're big donors, that free trade is a good thing because people can buy cheap plastic trinkets at Walmart inexpensively, or flat screen TVs inexpensively, and to hell with the literally millions of jobs that we've
Mm-hmm.
lost and the downward wage vortex that it's caused, when all those people that would be working in factories in the United States instead are competing to be baristas and waiters and warehouse workers and call center workers. Well, that lowers the entire wage floor. And we've seen this pandemic related labor shortage lead to some correction in that and some upward ratcheting up of pay for the middle class and the lower middle income people. But it is still way out of balance. And Republicans don't get that. And they are, the Republican Party is too corporatist, it's too Wall Street, it's too controlled by big money donors. But of course, ironically, many of those big money donors or others that are of the same ilk donate to the Democratic Party. So
Right.
you just have a gridlock, and I think worst of all, you have a lack of creative thinking. You have a lack of innovation. You have a lack of dialogue, because again, there are some really smart people in both parties, and the party itself is a straitjacket and a muzzle, and you literally cannot say anything positive about any kind of substantive or prominent idea that comes from the other party, and that is catastrophic for our
And
country.
remember, you
We're
said that,
competing
not
with
me.
China. We're competing with
Right.
China, right? And we can't afford that.
Right. And so look, so the fact that you're able to criticize both parties, I mean, that is literally one of the reasons why I've said that, I'm not that much of a fan of the pundit class, but it's why I do enjoy speaking with you. But with that being said, speaking of television, or television networks, one that we did not cover here that sort of is a bit of an outlier in this situation, well, RT America, or Russia Today, just canceled itself by taking their operations down. Well, in part because, two carriers dropped them. I'm sure that had a little bit to do with it. But I want to know what's your opinion of RT America in general, because I know their production company in DC had to register as a foreign agent, and ever since I remember seeing that, I said, well, that's quite interesting. Does that not mean that people who are appearing on the network, what does that make you, right? As a contributor?
Well, now, what were you saying about legislation in Washington?
Oh, no, I was saying their production company for RT America in DC had to register as a foreign agent. And I was saying that, the network RT America had to they recently took themselves off the air. And I was wondering what you think about that. The, I guess, self-demise of RT America now.
Okay, say that again, because I'm having a little trouble hearing you. As I told Bonnie before we started, I'm long-winded as it is, and if I think I can't hear him or he's not talking, God help him and everybody that's watching, because I'm off to the races. So
Yes.
Try to let me understand that better.
Sure. Sorry about that. So I was saying that regarding other television networks, RT America recently just took themselves down. They took the operations down, fired most of their staff. In part, it was because Roku and I believe DirecTV canceled them. So I'm sure they had something to do with it. But I wanted to know that, what do you think of what RT America did? Because they were being criticized for promoting Russian propaganda. And so do you think that they should have stayed on as a network? Do you think that they were bad and should stay down?
What was canceled on the network?
RT America just took their operations down.
Oh, RT. Yeah,
Yes.
I've actually been on RT. I was told it was the worst interview that I ever did, because I kept interrupting because it was insane. It was like Alice in Wonderland. Vladimir Putin might as well have been the host of the program. Like the number one terrorist nation in America is the United States, or in the world is the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like. And I had to interrupt, so I wasn't at my best. So I was not invited back. Unlike you who has unlimited patience and is willing to tolerate me and my quirks, they couldn't handle it, and I wasn't in any way reinforcing or giving credence to the Russian line. But to answer your question, and I think this gets to this whole thing of cancel culture, which, by the way, began as campus culture. This started on college campuses, shutting down speakers. Now, of course, some colleges are controlled directly or indirectly by state governments or state colleges. So I guess you can say that they should be covered by the First Amendment. But I'm of two minds on that. On the one hand, I think especially students, but all Americans, should hear a very wide range of discourse, even if it's distasteful, even if it's offensive, but to a point. I also think that private institutions and private media outlets that are, not controlled by the government, and of course then not subject to the First Amendment, should have every right to control who can speak or write or emanate information or opinion on their platform. Now, we have this issue with the internet, uniquely. Internet and social media sites are covered by that, called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically treats a platform. Of course, back then when the law was written, none of these platforms existed.
Right.
But it treats a platform like Twitter or IG, Instagram, Facebook, as if they are like like Verizon or T-Mobile or AT&T, and they're just a carrier of information, and they're not intervening to edit, and they're not involved in the content creation. Well, needless to say, that's laughable, because all of those entities have hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are in effect changing the content, selectively removing content, curating the content. That is not what Verizon. I'm on AT&T. I'm sure if they curated my content, about half my calls wouldn't go through. They probably would be canceled. But they are not curating content. You can make a phone call on Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, whatever, and they're not going to, suddenly, drop the call because, you say something offensive or you utter hate speech.
Right.
But literally, that is basically the paradigm that is governing these social media sites. It is not what governs, certainly not broadcast TV. Even with all the loosening of content restrictions, there are still controls and limitations on broadcast television and even cable television. And all of those outlets are subject to libel laws. And if you can show malice, if you could show that the head of CNN was executing a political agenda and trying to impair a candidate and using the resources of CNN to do that. Now, you could say Jeff Zucker, in effect, was doing that in behalf of Andrew Cuomo when he was governor. But, they can be sued for that. Whereas Twitter, Facebook, Instagram cannot be sued for that under Section 230. There's a safe harbor for them that does not exist for any other other media outlet. And so, on the one hand, I think those entities, they are privately owned, privately controlled, not government entities, should have the ability to determine who can be on their platform. But I don't think they should have the best of both worlds. They shouldn't be able to exercise an editorial judgment, which that is, and still be protected from the kinds of laws that rein in newspapers and cable and broadcast outlets. So Section 230, I don't think it needs to be completely eliminated, but it needs to be overhauled, drastically overhauled. So that gets back to RT. I think, pay TV carriers, if they think there's an audience for that, arguably they should carry it. But I think the United States, and this has been true ever since our founding, if we find that an entity is emanating propaganda, and certainly if it's in wartime, we have routinely, the federal government, despite the First Amendment, has routinely shut them down.
That's the significant part.
Or blacked them
wartime
out or
propaganda.
in. I mean, that's happened. that's happened throughout our history. So you could argue that we're at war right now indirectly with Russia because they've invaded a neighboring country, not a NATO country, but nevertheless, we're providing military support to the Ukrainians. So we've certainly taken sides in that. So in effect, Russia is an adversary in that conflict. And so you could argue that RT is an extension of their military effort and should not be allowed in. I mean, so again, but this is why we have a democracy and why we have due process, or we're supposed to, because you have laws and you have rules, but at the end of the day, especially on complex matters, you need you need human beings working within the law and within the regulations to make a judgment call.
Right.
And if they make a bad judgment call and they're in elected office, they can be voted out of office or they can be impeached. Okay. And if even it's hard to get rid of a bureaucrat if they're covered by civil service, something else that needs to be reformed dramatically. But we have mechanisms, and we have a judicial system where you can sue people. So we have mechanisms to deal with that. So the idea that nothing can be changed or nothing can be fixed because it's a slippery slope to doing X. Well, guess what? Every law you make, every regulation, every restriction is a slippery slope. If shoplifting is illegal, well, someone could say, well, pretty soon they're going to make shopping illegal. I mean, that's the logical extension of that.
Right.
If you think about it, which gets back to the party problem that we have. Every law that's passed, anything that might restrict or govern anything, everyone takes it to the extreme. And by that standard, you can't have speed limits. Pretty soon they're going to say you have to go 20 miles an hour on the highway. If you can't go 90, that means pretty soon they're going to say you can only go 20. That's what we're hearing from Washington. That's what we're hearing from MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN, always about the other side's ideas. And again, this is why we need an open system. I think we should get rid of political parties. The way you do that is that you remove all references and all support for political parties in government-funded elections. Primaries, you remove the parties, you don't allow the parties to control the primaries. The states control the primaries, or the localities control the primaries, and you have the top three. You have a primary based on petitions, and you have to qualify for the ballot, and it's more or less what they have in California and they have in Louisiana and a few other states, where it's basically a jungle primary, and your top three vote getters, irrespective of party, I mean, they're free to align with any organization they want, but that organization will not be sanctioned by the state, or its operation in terms of elections will not be funded by the state or the federal government. You take out all references to parties in election law. The Federal Election Commission does not govern party nominations, and they take that completely out. And you have, I think it should be the top three, not the top two, but the top three vote getters in a primary are on the general election ballot. And they can say they're conservative, they're liberal, they can say that they're a Democrat, they can say they're a Republican, they can say they're a vegetarian, whatever it is. But that affiliation, that organization, has nothing to do with election law or how the elections are held. That's completely ad hoc. That's completely decoupled from how the elections are conducted. And on the presidential level, we have to basically come up with a national presidential primary that is decoupled from parties. And frankly, that would probably require, delegates or a vote that would be weighted in some way similar to the Electoral College, so that California, Texas, and Florida wouldn't control the nominees of the parties, automatically. So you might need some kind of weighting there, or some kind of offset but again, we've got to take parties out of the system. We've got to do what George Washington wisely and presciently said, which is not have political parties. It is just wrecking our country. They've just been disastrous, just very bad.
Hey, so I think that I would agree with that. So look, on the state regarding state elections, supporting jungle primaries, I am all for. As someone who's been a former party official and and have watched how these elections are done and how you can choose different primaries, sometimes based on how you feel about certain candidates. For instance, I watched that a couple times and I said, "Oh no, this process is absolutely not for me." And to go on the federal level and to be able to decouple this from those elections from the two party system, I 100% support. Because again, the reason why I left the party was because I'm a policy person. Like, I like solutions, as you said, and
Me
every
too.
every time
Yeah, we're
partisanship.
oddballs, aren't we? We actually are interested in policy. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
That's first and foremost to me.
every time a party gets thrown in there, it ruins it. I would always say while the partisan bickering is happening. So at what point do we get back to fixing something, to how addressing how to actually solve something? The policy part that never happens. I speak to a lot of people who say that they feel that they have to spend all their time doing the attacking, and attacking the other side, and I would.
It's very cynical. It's you just said it, attack the other side. We have a bunch of people, not all the politicians. I think there are a lot of politicians in both parties. I mean, they all have egos, et cetera, et cetera. They love being elected and whatever. But if people didn't have that, probably nobody would run for office. So there may be negatives to their nature, but I still believe that most people, most elected officials, and most staff members, Hill staff members and gubernatorial staff members, really do want to do good. They really want to make a positive difference. But the political operatives, you
Mhm.
know, they are all about combat and putting points on the scoreboard, and they are wired that way. I mean, it's the whole way they've done business from the time they got into the business. So
Right.
it's that's what you have to break down. Now, here's what's interesting. You know, if you look at the donors, the big donors, most big donors. Now, there are a few. There are obviously CEOs who are very conservative or very liberal. You've got
Mhm.
the Ben and Jerry's who are on the left, and you've got the CEOs of some major companies that are identified with Republicans and very conservative. But the vast
Remind
majority
me of
of
making coffee.
donors do not like this bifurcation. That's why a lot of them donate to both parties. And wouldn't it be better if instead of donating to both parties, they could simply donate to candidates and not have to worry about balancing their donations to
Both
both
sides.
parties? And if they could
I
have
can agree.
access just by their direct connection to the candidate. And so ironically, I think two things could make possible this concept of, I call it parties over, PARTIESOVER, parties over, and I have we're going to build a website for that as an
Okay.
organization. But I think ironically, donors and social media make it possible to get rid of parties because social media, as we've seen with all kinds of movements, good and bad,
Yes.
creates the network. That's the scaffolding on which you can build huge movements, right? And the
Right.
donors, of course, provide the money, and certainly a lot of them, if not most of them, are not really. If they come out of the business world, and even some of the non-business donors are not so much fixated on party as they are issue positions and certain ideas and certain agendas and maybe certain candidates. And so, ironically, as much as we malign donors, big donors, and as much as we malign social media, those two entities actually are what make it possible for us to get over the hump and get rid of these relics. I believe they're relics of the 19th century into the maybe early 20th century political parties, and have a really open system. And again, we have all the infrastructure needed for candidates to reach voters. We obviously have no problem raising hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to
Right.
support candidates and to support issues. and you already have a 501c3 political organizations that run ads based on specific positions. Maybe it's negotiating drug prices or
Right.
trade or energy regulation, whatever. They already have ads on that affect the public consciousness, but they're not tied to party. In fact, they can't be.
Right. Right.
So the foundation is there. The pieces are in place for us to eschew political parties and to have a truly the kind of open system, the kind of nonpartisan system that George Washington and many of our other founders envisioned.
And to show you about you have to have the political will to do something like that.
Right. By the
Like,
way, it's a lot easier to have the political will when you're not shackled by your party.
of course,
There are a
of
lot of
course,
candidates that would actually, I think, take some pretty brave positions. They would be outside the box if they were not afraid of just being a complete outcast, a
right.
heretic within their own party, and lose all of their ability to have influence within the House or the Senate, or to to run for higher office. If they weren't worried about that, ironically, I don't think it's so much that the candidates are afraid to take bold stands on positions. It is that they feel like they can't take that stand
Yeah.
if they're associated with, let's say, the Republican or the Democratic Party. I can't say that if I'm a Democrat. I can't say that if I'm a Republican. I'd be willing to if I
Hmm.
weren't going to, in effect, be shut out by my own party by doing so.
Yeah, similarly. And so, of the issues that were my last straw, things that occurred over, the last, say, year to two, 1 to 2 years, one of them being, for instance, I'll throw out critical race theory, for instance. Um, I remember the first thing that came to mind as I was looking into the origins of this. This was someone by the name of Christopher Rufo who appeared on Tucker Carlson's show with some part of a school curriculum. And as he made this appearance and some subsequent ones, he was on Twitter talking about this, saying, "Yeah, I lumped all the race stuff together so that I could fearmonger people into the next election cycle." And so he's repeatedly saying right there in the open on Twitter, I took all these screenshots of him literally saying that he's lying. And I said, how does this happen? How does this guy, get to go on television? And he's so bold that he's writing it right there. I'm lying. Not maybe the word lying. And then it goes further. I was heavily involved in that election cycle, and I remember there was this narrative here in Virginia of how parents deserve to be heard. And I kept saying to myself,
Youngkin got elected.
yes, but I said, so when did parents stop having a voice? And I said, this is very strange to me because it's so odd that these people are saying that they keep talking about parents. We care so much about parents. And I just said, something doesn't seem right with this. And I started writing down names of people who were making television appearances on Fox. And it was revealed that almost all of them were parents who just happened to not have their political titles, in the Shrone underneath their name. Everyone was a lobbyist. Everyone, there was the head of the one woman was a parent. She was on Vox News. Is it Vox? I think it was Vox. Vice News. Shoot, one of the two. As she was the head of the Loudoun County Republican Women's Club, and um, she had been working doing conservative mailings since the 90s. But that just so happened to have been left out. And so, it just shows how skewed things were at the time, how dishonest that it was, because this wasn't, just the voice of parents. And tell me if I'm wrong. I kept saying when all of this started and there was all this fuss in Loudoun County, I said, as just at a first glance of this, that's right outside of DC. That sounds like a bunch of lobbyists. That doesn't even sound right. I refuse to believe that, the center of our education debate is going to come out of Loudoun County. So whatever it is, I'm sure it's a lie. And I've remained with that stance ever since. I think that if DC suburbs ever get really riled up about something, I can guarantee that there's money all into it. and that also proved to be a thing, dark money. But tell me what is your take about uh, this critical race theory hysteria that's been happening? They're beating
Well,
people up around here in school board meetings.
here I think are the two kind of key elements to that whole debate. One is that we do have people in politics that appear to not revere, kind of rhymes, but appear to not revere the United States. They focus entirely on our flaws and are almost, at best, reluctant to herald our achievements and the wonderful things that we have done. And they just appear to many people
Hmm.
not to respect our country and not to believe that it's something
Keyword being
sacred
appear.
and to be treasured. So, and those same kinds of people tend to be the supporters or aligned with those that are promulgating or have said it's okay to have what's being called critical race theory, which of course is a catch-all term and often a misnomer for what they're even talking about. So that's one element. But the other element, and frankly the more prominent element in my opinion, is that the vast majority of white people are completely clueless about race. It doesn't mean they're haters, it doesn't mean they're bigots, but they are in a fantasy land when it comes to our racial situation. They truly believe, and I'm saying, as a white person, I'm saying that I believe that the vast majority of white people believe that because we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and a plethora of other laws that, you know, built on those over the ensuing decades, that hey, it's an even playing field. Our racial problems are over, and these people that keep talking about it are belly aching and looking for excuses, and
You
they're going
said that, not
to
me.
stop. And you can tell me if you agree. That's my take as a white person who talks to a
Hmm.
lot of white people, and here's what they say. Sometimes in unguarded moments, and frankly, sometimes I'll say it's innocent. I don't think it's ever innocent to be uninformed or willfully
Hmm.
uninformed. But my point is, I don't think they're often not even saying it with animus. It's bewilderment. It's just like, gee, everything's pretty much okay. Look at Oprah Winfrey. We had a black president. It can't be that bad. So it's cluelessness. Now, again, I think everybody owes it to themselves and to our country to not be clueless.
Hmm.
If you're on the left and
Yes.
a hard lefty, you need to learn more about where the right is coming from. If you're on the right, you need to learn more about where the left is coming from or where the critical race theorist might be coming from. So what we come down to, and as I've watched this critical race theory, I'll give it that name, even though again it's a
Hmm.
misnomer. Uh,
Right.
Forgive me for digressing or
It's
trying
okay.
to patronize anybody, but critical race theory is really was a law school, a legal concept, and I think the underlying premise of it is that uh, our many of our racial problems continue because there are structural impediments that continue in our society, despite the civil rights laws and despite the steps that have been taken to equalize opportunity for Black people, that there are ingrained aspects of our society and our structure and our economy that do continue to discriminate against these people. Well, guess what? That's absolutely true. And anyone that doesn't believe that is either lying or crazy. I mean, when you have Black people with 5 times the incarceration rate, 3 times the poverty rate, less than 10% of the average wealth of white people. I'm sorry, that's not something that it just happens or gee, they're out of luck. They just you give them another 100 years and they'll catch up.
That is exactly what, look, the Loudoun County Republican Women's Club woman, that was exactly what she said. She said, regarding being stopped by the police, well, maybe it's how they carry themselves. Maybe it's their clothing. Really?
Hey, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Well,
but
I spoke to a college class a couple of years ago at a historically Black college in the Dallas area, Paul Quinn College, and speaking to a bunch of students. I think all of them were black, and we were discussing some of these issues and just kind of and at that time the critical race theory thing hadn't even come up, but just kind of the racial mindset.
Hmm.
And it was fascinating how many black students spoke up and said, well, wait a minute. If a policeman stops you, you can't have an attitude. You've got to do X, Y, and Z. So, that would have sounded completely normal coming out of the average white person's mouth. And it was not
Hmm.
like this person was some kind of right wing Republican. They were
Right.
just trying to be rational and prudent in what they were suggesting. Of course, others were saying, well, people shouldn't have to put on a certain act because of their skin color in order not to be shot or not to be, improperly arrested or
Right.
roughed up or whatever. So my point is that there is, there's some truth to that, of course, but the problem is that we have a group of people, a subset of our population, that's roughly 13% of our population, most of whom, the vast majority of them, were descended from black people that were subjected to first nearly 250 years of slavery. And I've heard people say, well, they had slavery in Africa. Well, wait a minute. First of all, none of those African countries, and at that time they weren't even all delineated by countries, it was tribal lands,
Right.
none of them were extolling themselves as beacons of democracy and freedom, right? They weren't
Right.
even
There's a
pretending. In
different.
fact,
Yeah.
most European countries were not pretending to be democratic or beacons of freedom. But the United States, uniquely, was on a high horse as the democracy, the bastion of liberty. And yet we were the first country, really, you can say maybe Brazil did to an extent, but probably certainly the biggest economy in the world to put slavery on an industrial scale. And being enslaved as a war reparation by a neighboring tribe where the culture is somewhat similar to what you're accustomed to. I'm not saying that's okay or that's great, but
Hmm.
that's a hell of a lot different than being shipped overseas, a bunch of, in horribly inhumane conditions, packed in with people from across the African continent that you have a very different cultural uh, experience than they do, packed in with them and sent thousands of miles to a completely foreign country and culture where a bunch of people think you're inferior and basically not much more than animals. Uh, and that was not true in Africa. I mean, at least if people were enslaved in Africa, they were considered, roughly equal as human beings. Nothing like what happened over here. So they
That
spent
that's a
hundreds of years
that's a
enslaved
simple detail.
by a
That's
country that extolled itself as a democratic country.
yeah.
And then after the slaves are finally freed, but of course, very belatedly by the 13th Amendment, they then suffered another century of wanton terrorism, heinous oppression, unceasing humiliation, incessant marginalization. No other people group in our country. Now, a lot of certainly Hispanics have been mistreated, and there's some horrible history with Hispanics, and certainly with Chinese and the Irish, especially in the Northeast and parts of Massachusetts, horrible treatment. But none of those people groups were enslaved. None of them were considered to the same degree inferior, beneath humanity by white people. And the white people, the white power structure, up well into the 1950s, including our federal government, went to great lengths to set up intricate systems, often camouflaged systems, because they knew it was wrong. All this was
Hmm.
right. They wouldn't have gone to such great lengths to make it look legitimate.
Right.
They would just go right out and say, we don't want black people to do X. So a lot of the things that, I mean, there were black laws and there were, of course, specific laws that segregated people and discriminated against black people. But a lot of it was just infused into the system on the sneak tip.
Hmm.
It was put in there, and they created rubrics that didn't say black people, can't do this or can't do that, but basically made it impossible for them to advance in the same way other people groups have. So today we have the ghettos that we have in this country were by design. It was not an accident. It was not just because a bunch of black people that had low incomes decided they wanted to live together. They didn't have the option to live in white
Fact.
neighborhoods. They didn't have the option to get mortgages and buy, even if they had the money to buy houses in quote unquote white neighborhoods. Uh, they were subjected to just egregious mortgage fraud. They were not given mortgages, even federally government backed mortgages, until well into the 1950s.
Hmm.
Redlining, in other words, don't loan to certain neighborhoods, which were almost all predominantly black, that was invented by the federal government, not by some company or some bank.
Right.
That was invented by the federal government in terms of what mortgages it would guarantee. The Federal Housing Administration invented redlining.
We still have redlining
People were
lawsuits.
ingrained, and when you have young children brought up in low income neighborhoods where there are very few good jobs, where they're surrounded by older kids and young adults that have unfortunately devolved into drug use and or crime, and that's the example. And then they've got an overextended single mother trying to make ends meet, trying to work and keep the household together. A lot of these kids are latchkey kids. They don't have good examples, good adult supervision. They are exposed to some of the worst influences you can imagine, and they are, again, not in a position, when they're 16 to just easily get a good job like a lot of white kids are. And you wonder why they don't turn out okay, you know. And as I said in a video that I did a year or so ago, if any other people group had been subjected to what black people have been throughout our history, if any other people group had gone through that experience, nobody with a brain would would ascribe the fact that that group is relatively disadvantaged. Nobody would ascribe that to a lack of ability or will if it was any other group. But black people, there's something wrong. There are white people that I think literally believe that black people are born with a crime gene. That they are predisposed to commit crimes. Never
Well,
mind
people write
horrific
that.
acts of
That's been
violence
written
that they
plenty of
commit.
times.
But so the whole basis of this critical race theory debate is frankly that most white people don't get it, and they also think that if you criticize America or talk honestly about our racial history, which is evil, it goes beyond bad, it goes beyond abominable. Evil is the only word to come up with it, and it would be
Hmm.
evil for any country, but especially one that held itself up as a democracy, as a new kind of country where everybody was free and everybody was equal. That's what we were saying. Okay,
Right.
it was false advertising. Okay, because we had a substantial subset, literally millions of people within our borders, that were in effect living in a police state. They were all, of course, many were imprisoned wrongly, but they might as well have been in prison. They were so limited in their ability to move and their ability to
Right.
work and their ability to function. Um, and so no other group was ever subjected to that. And we have not come close to unwinding all of the vestiges of that. We are still raising children in low income, predominantly black neighborhoods. We are still allowing them to grow up in these cauldrons of privation and dysfunction. We're not doing, we're trying to make the schools better, but most of the schools are in these low income areas are abominable.
Hmm.
Certainly the government run schools. We're not letting enough of these kids go into charter schools and have competition and have innovation that will give these kids a better chance. And we're not doing anything, I think most importantly of all, to provide a safe environment for these low income kids when they get out of school, from 3 o'clock until 7 o'clock at night.
Right.
There should be after school for every, I would say the 10 million poorest kids in our country should be guaranteed the ability to go to a YMCA or another privately run uh, after school program, and also have that a full day program during the summer. That would expose those kids to good influences, would enable them to get their homework done, would keep them safe for at least a few more hours a day, right? For at
Right.
least a few more hours a day, they would have something approaching the stability and the safety that most middle class and upper class kids enjoy in our country. Why? Why isn't it considered a national emergency that we are continuing to allow children to grow up in these atrocious circumstances, and then when they become embroiled in the criminal justice system or become dependent on social welfare, oh, they've got something wrong with them. And another thing I said in the video is, let's take some kids from Winnetka, Illinois, or the Upper East Side of New York, or Beverly Hills, or Highland Park, Texas, or the Woodlands in Houston, uh, and let's take some of those babies and raise them in some of these low income, predominantly minority neighborhoods in our country, and let's see how they turn out. Let's see, you know, if they end up getting jobs as vice presidents and become successful entrepreneurs. Let me tell you something, they won't. When you have a corrosive set of influences for 15 years in a child's life and a lack of stability and often danger for 15 years and more of a young person's life, uh, is scarring. That is
Yes.
giving them the wrong mindset. And we have to consider that a priority in this country to fix that. And the problem, what I just said about our history and
Mm-hmm.
what we need to do, if I went to a school board meeting and said, this is going to be in our curriculum, that would be critical race theory. And I would be considered a, a dangerous influence on children for saying what I just said. Now, Ronnie, think about this. You hear people say bad things about their parents, about their spouses, sometimes about their kids, about their coworkers,
Mm-hmm.
and you know they love them. I mean, sometimes you
Right.
don't, but people that you know they love, right? But they bring up or they'll acknowledge their faults. Okay, they don't
Mm-hmm.
always blindly support everything that they do or say that everything they do is great. And, well, he is mad about that, but he's a great guy. Okay, you hear that all the time.
Right.
Okay, why, if we're comfortable with that, can we not say that our country is a great country? It's an amazing country. It is a wonderful country, but it has been guilty of almost unspeakable,
I mean,
almost
I'm
unimaginable
even willing to listen to the
evils.
people who don't
And,
think that it's a great
we have still
place.
not fixed, we have still not overcome the vestiges of those evils. Why can't an intelligent, patriotic person say that? Just as if you were at a company, a company CEO, you can say, hey, we met our profit target for this product. You know, we've improved operations at this level. You know, we've fixed this problem, but we still have X, Y, and Z that are not up to standard, and we've got to fix it. That's how businesses work. That's how I certainly worked in business.
Yes.
I didn't at the end of
Look,
the year say
it's too much
everything was
like
great. We
right.
had no problems.
That's the
Everything was
problem.
wonderful.
It's too much. It's too much like right. I mean, you know, to state what the disadvantages are of being here and what some of the negatives are. This is literally like my political ideology. There are a few candidates and some supporters locally where I am who think that I either bully or I'm just Vonnie's not playing nice. He's not being Vonnie's being mean to me. No, Vonnie is asking you questions. And when people want to go and hide and not answer questions, or just you want to run away from conversation, you're only making it worse for yourself. And so the same goes with this. One of the criticisms that a local Republican that I know was having regarding critical race theory was a homework assignment that a child had. I don't remember what age. I think it was junior high school. That listed different groups, or I think it asked children to, was it ranking privilege, whether it was a single white man, whether it was a child that was um, a military kid, things like that. And so that might be something that could be seen as divisive for the sake of conversation. When we're discussing privilege, there's a lot of things that come with that. And, this could be a good time, in my opinion, to, because that was really the lesson that just got a lot of people. I think that one was in the news. Well, we could lay out what all of the stereotypes are. Like one of the military kids said, well, he was offended by this because his dad was never home. Okay, well then, okay then, we get to this. We get to disprove that one, and then also discuss what other people see that the advantages are of growing up that way. The single white male might say that, hey, he came out of West Virginia, and or they came out of West Virginia. They made near six figures. In the 90s, and NAFTA came, and now it's minimum wage overnight. So yeah, privilege where? But these are conversations to have. But we're banning Maya Angelou and whomever whomever else. The first black kid that showed up to there was an integrated school because they described the child as facing a white mob and that was divisive. What the hell else did the child face?
Right. Well,
But yes, we should be able to discuss all facets of this.
yeah, things. I think we do have to be careful, and early on at the outset of
That was a
the
very tough one that I mentioned, but after
you
thinking of
talked
it for a
about
while,
parents having, parents being involved and I actually think most parents have not paid attention to the curriculum that their kids are taught. And frankly, they probably ought to worry a lot more about the math and the reading curriculum
yeah.
even than some of this. But so parents haven't been that involved. It's sad to me that what got so many parents engaged was alarmism over something that actually officially isn't even being taught, critical race theory, but even broaching race or even talking about our history on race authentically is what got parents. Unfortunately, the first thing a lot of white people want to tell you is, I'm not a racist. That's, if you, if you want to talk about race, I'm not a racist. Which,
Hmm.
again, somewhat understandable. Many white people feel like they're being put on the defensive and that they're being called a
Well,
racist
it's the worst thing to
on
be
purpose.
called. I completely understand that.
But I think when you get to the curriculum, first of all, I hate the word privilege.
Hmm.
I hate the phrase white privilege, not because it isn't somewhat accurate. I mean, based on what I discussed earlier, just the metrics, in
Hmm.
effect, you could say white people are inherently privileged in our society. But I'm a marketing guy. My
Hmm.
background, I've said my background is business. A lot of that was focused on marketing and trying to change minds or
Okay.
to get people to adopt a different point of view. The worst thing you can do if you're trying to get white people to buy in and actually contribute to the solutions to these problems is to tell them that they're privileged. It's a terrible word. It's just bad marketing. It isn't even a matter of is there any, yeah, there's some accuracy to it, but it's bad marketing. Here's what I propose as a replacement for white privilege.
Hmm.
The white edge. The white edge. Now, I'm sure a lot of white people wouldn't even be comfortable with that. They'd say, well, black people have an edge because they've got affirmative action. So some wouldn't even buy that. But I bet a
Okay.
lot more white people would at least listen to that because you can demonstrate that in the metrics. White people have an edge in a variety of respects within our society. And again, it doesn't mean they don't work hard. It doesn't mean they have it easy, but they do have an advantage. They have an edge in, in every realm of our society. First of all, every realm of our society is controlled by white people, including rap music,
Yeah.
including sports, even though the vast majority of players in the NFL and NBA are black. The owners, one, two owners, coaches that
Hmm.
have a meaningful chunk of a team, uh, it is controlled by white people and many of them are great white people, and many of them are visionary and trying to make the society better. But the point is, it's controlled by white people. So uh, I think we have to be careful, though. If you like ranking privilege, I'm a reading tutor. I tutor a young lady, 8-year-old.
Okay.
You have to
Very
be
nice.
very conscious when you're teaching about the impact of everything that you say and do.
Yes.
And I don't think there's any. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. I cannot think of any value to ranking people and ranking privilege. That sounds a little bit. That
But
sounds fascist.
yeah.
That sounds racist. Now, can you have a discussion that white people have an edge in our society, and here's why, and maybe here's why they don't, and let's talk about that? Absolutely. I'd love that to be discussed in our classrooms. Okay. Anytime you talk about race, especially in an integrated classroom, of course, it risks division. It risks some people internalizing things that they hear, or maybe affecting their self-esteem. But you know what? I'm sorry, teaching's hard work. Learning is an arduous process. And that means every moment of it can't be all sweetness and light and all comfortable and all nice and cushy. Sometimes you have to discuss very uncomfortable topics, and sometimes they are divisive. And guess what? That's why we're supposed to have good teachers, good principals, good administrators, and good parental input,
Right.
so that you create a curriculum that, while it might not be perfect, avoids the most potentially noxious outcomes.
Right.
But again, the solution is not to avoid discussing race, avoid discussing the evils that our country perpetrated for 350 years and in many ways continues to perpetrate. That's not the solution. The solution, as with any problem, if it's in business, if it's in government, if it's in a church, if it's in a nonprofit organization, the key is admitting your failings and then saying, how are we going to fix them? The businesses that go bankrupt, the nonprofits that become irrelevant, the government officials that are voted out of office are always the ones that deny problems. Oh,
See?
everything's fine. Let's be positive.
Yep.
Let's not talk about that. It is possible.
That
Again,
sounds like
it's
my city
possible today.
government.
We have a great country, a wonderful country, arguably in many ways the best country in the world, and that's not jingoism. It's made up of people that are descended from every country in the world. So
Right.
it's hardly a knock on the rest of the world, since our entire population is
Right.
descended from immigrants. But you can say that and still say, but you know what? We did some evil shit for 350 years. God awful. It was an embarrassment. It was terrible. It's one reason communism took hold in the world. It was our racism. It was people looking and saying, wait a minute, they're a democracy and they have millions of people that are, in effect, living in a police state and living
And
in,
no one and that and that's
horrific
the part
conditions.
that doesn't
That
get
was one reason communism spread the
yes.
way that it did.
People literally running away from that. And that's something that doesn't get acknowledged today. There were a lot of things that we were doing at that time where people, there's a lot of black Russians, specifically for that reason. They all took off from this country at that time.
Yeah.
So
So it's,
I would
I don't
listen
want
to a
to go
class of you
too
teaching that.
deeply, but I think I would like us to introduce a curriculum that I would call, instead of critical race theory, I would call it critical race reality,
Okay.
CRR or CR2, critical race reality, which is, hey, we perpetrated these evils for 350 years. It was beneath us. It was completely at odds with our standards
Hmm.
that we announced to the world, that we advertised to the world. We've done a lot to turn it around, but not enough. Here there is that we should talk about focusing on to make it better. And I don't understand why that would be controversial. I don't understand why so many adults think that their child can master, uh, iPhone apps and video games and complex things involving technology, but somehow their little ears can't hear, real talk about race. It's going to somehow destroy them emotionally, or they just can't process all of that. That's insulting to kids. It's dangerous for our country, and it's that lack of insight, that cluelessness on the part of so many white people that has perpetuated our racial problems in this country. Again, most of it is not done with animus. Most of the mistakes that white people are making from a policy point of view are not, we've got to put those black people down, at least not
Hmm.
consciously. It is,
It's just from not
no, we
knowing.
can't do that. That's extremism, or that would just help one group of people. It's just a lack of thinking. And I'll close by saying we are competing with China. I mentioned this about when we talked about parties.
Hmm.
We are competing with a country with more than 4 times our population. Okay, it already has an economy that, by some metrics, is as large as ours. It's certainly the second largest in the world, if it isn't as big as ours. They are stealing our technology. They are working at a breakneck pace to to overtake us on technology, never mind the military. And we need all hands on deck. We need every American competing and up to the ability to compete in terms of education, in terms of life education, that in terms of stability. We cannot afford to be raising 10 million kids in this country in substandard situations where they are much
I
more
agree.
likely to become involved in the criminal justice system,
Mhm.
involved in needing social welfare. That's beneath it. We cannot throw away 10 million kids. Now, thank God, obviously, some of those kids transcend that and overcome that, and God love them. But unfortunately, the vast majority do not. It's hard to raise a middle class white kid without him or her getting in trouble and making
Right.
a lot of mistakes. I mean, as a parent, I raised two wonderful kids, but I'll tell you, even when you have all the advantages that so many of us have, a lot of bad
Still
things can
tough.
happen with kids. Imagine multiplying that by 100. Imagine if right outside your house, no matter how well you ran your house, right outside were drug dealers and criminals and gunshots at night. Imagine if you couldn't afford childcare and you had to let tell your kid to lock himself or herself in at 3 o'clock when they get home from school at 4 o'clock, and knowing that the streets were teeming with gang members and criminals, and that one way or the other they were probably going to encounter them and look at them, and maybe they've got a lot of bling or they've got a nice car, and they're thinking, why are they doing well and nobody else around here seems to be doing well? I mean, that's
Hmm.
completely rational. As any white kid, any
Absolutely.
Asian kid, anybody in that situation would probably ask that same question. Um, so we cannot afford to continue that. And I wish, even President Biden, the Democrat, that one they're calling a socialist, even he has not elevated that to the point that it needs to be in public discussion, and certainly the Republicans have. This needs to be looked at as for, even if you're not altruistic, even if you're somewhat racist, even if you think the whole thing with black people is overblown, what you I think will acknowledge is we're taking on a titan in China that has more than 4 times our population, and more of those 1.5 billion people are going to learn how to code and learn how to work in high technology. They're eventually going to come off the farm, a lot of them.
Hmm.
More and more are going to pour in, and numbers, when people are well educated, numbers are a huge advantage. Okay,
Yes.
you can't deny. So we need all hands on deck. We need every American ready to compete, not because we're nice people, not because we love everybody. I mean, those are great traits to have. I hope people feel that way. But irrespective of that, we have got to have
The future of the
everybody ready
country
to compete. We can't
counts on
lose
it.
this away anymore.
Absolutely. So look, so
And we
we're
haven't even
now.
talked about Ukraine.
I was actually going to.
Maybe
Hey,
that's anything to laugh about.
yes, that was next. So look, we are now what 2 weeks into what we are hoping is now going to turn into the Third World War, and as an extension of this race conversation, Putin said that he is doing this, attacking Ukraine, for the sake of the quote unquote denazification of the country. Which, for one interesting aspect of this is that people can't seem to determine which side to be on. So that's interesting. I mean, if someone bombs hospitals, I would think
I
that's
will not be on that side. I will be on the other side.
and yes,
Easy.
and I will add. What else did he do? Well, the threatening of nuclear war again, right? So I said I thought that we had determined that this was a bad thing some time ago. That's kind of part of why a main reason we have the UN, so that we don't go to nuclear war again. So that's two reasons not to be on that side. But so one in one of the added commentary that we had to these attacks on Ukraine was former President Trump calling Putin smart for what he did
Genius.
and genius. And it seems like that, which to me, I saw that statement as the same thing when during the summer of 2020, when it was Candace Owens read off George Floyd's rap sheet and Trump retweeted it. And we were all on one page until that moment. And that was it through the election. And so now I said, so now we have, people who are struggling with whether or not Putin should be, you know, uh, whether we should be on his side in this debate after that. But what do you make of where we are with this? Do you think
Well,
this is going to turn into a world war?
well, I let me put
We're
it
going to
this
end up
way.
in another. Well, hope
I think
Biden's trying to keep us out of another Middle East
I don't think
quagmire.
Putin wants World War III any more than we do.
Uh-huh.
I don't think he's, he claims to be a Christian, but I think he is of the world, and I think he wants to live to see what he perceives as great things happen for his country, or to be, lionized as the next, Lenin or Peter the Great. Um, so I don't think he wants to be the guy that destroyed or nearly destroyed the world, or destroyed in huge chunks of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and led to us entering a dystopian um, existence. So I don't think he will be easily provoked into launching ICBMs or anything of that
Okay.
nature. I think for him, this is this is rational. Keep in mind, his main goal is to stay in power. He's got an economy that is at near depression level. Our economy is about 15 times the size of the Russian economy. 15 times. We have almost twice the population. They have a huge land area, but
Right.
they don't have the capabilities of exploiting all that they have. And so, first of all, he wants to stay in power, and this kind of military action, this kind of adventurism, is a distraction. The Russians culturally, going back to the czars, and certainly with the onset of communism in the 1920s, um, have had this sense of being put upon, of always being the little red-headed stepchild, the
Mm-hmm.
inferior country, not quite up to the standards of, France, Germany, uh, United Kingdom,
Right.
and so there's a ready audience for that. There is this Russian. It's kind of a malaprop, probably, to put it this way, but it is kind of Russian jingoism or Russian chauvinism, and so I think part of it is a distraction. But I don't think he wants to start World War III. I do think he certainly wants to annex all of Ukraine. Uh, but we have to keep in mind also that this could be a rehearsal. This could be Putin getting his military in shape, and maybe he is thinking of moving maybe into the Baltic countries, or maybe even, who knows what, Eastern Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we can't rule that out. I think it's unlikely. I think he's got his hands full. As you said, it's been a 2 week war. It was supposed to be a 2 day war. Um, but we certainly, our military planners and our State Department, we all have to be thinking this is not beyond the realm of possibility.
Right.
Stuff that seemed, as you know, and whether it was military conflicts, whether it was Hitler taking over Germany and what he ended up doing, even COVID, and how COVID went from 15 days to flatten the curve
Right.
to
To today.
to
To
more than 15 months, really now 2 year over 2 years. Um, Things that seem impossible one day, a month later, can become reality.
right.
So stuff that we just think is nobody really cares. It's not that big a deal. It's just Ukraine, and we don't know. Again, I think it's unlikely Putin is going to try to recapture all of the Eastern Bloc, but it's not impossible. And if he just marches through Ukraine and succeeds, he's got a massive ego. He's apparently in denial on a lot of things. He could convince himself, hey, this is my time to move. This is my time to make a mark on history. This is my time to do what nobody else has done or would dare to do. So that has to be part of our calculus. Now, I don't think our providing weapons to Ukraine is going to lead to World War III. I think we need to get as many javelins and stingers and other weapons in there as we can.
It's not like we haven't helped them before, right? I
Right.
mean,
Well,
we've
actually,
been
it
doing this for
it
some
was Trump that
time.
started the lethal aid to the. He was the first to give lethal aid, actual weapons, the javelins and weapons that they could use to the Ukrainians. He was the first president to do that. So I do think, you talked about Trump saying that Putin was genius or smart, and people say, well, he was dripping with sarcasm when he said that. Well, not quite, not really. Um, I think, I think, on the one hand, Trump was more aggressive against Putin than probably any president since the end of the Cold War. Since Reagan, basically, he was probably, in terms of substantive, what we did in Syria, what we did providing lethal aid to the Ukrainians, the sanctions that were put on. We were pretty tough on the Russians. But at the end of the day, I think Trump was afraid of two things. He was afraid of two things: his own base, which is why he turned against masks when he actually thought masks were a good idea in private, according to people that know. He felt we should be mandating masks months before anybody was wearing masks. But his own base turned against it, and he was afraid to say, hey, no, you should wear a mask. He literally was afraid of his base. Same on the racial issues. He was afraid to be too non-racist or to be too overtly unracist because he was afraid of his own base. So Trump was afraid of his own base and is afraid of his own base, the monster he created.
Mm-hmm.
And number two,
Not
he's afraid of
surprised.
Vladimir Putin. And again, he did some aggressive things, but he would never say anything negative about the guy in public. We've seen the footage, I think, recently of him lecturing the head of NATO about, the lack of defense spending by Germany and NATO not pulling its weight in the alliance, which I don't like the way. I think he could have handled it more deftly, but substantively he's correct.
Mm-hmm.
But he never had a speech like that with Putin. Why? Putin had already annexed, Crimea.
Can I?
So why didn't he
I
have?
want to interrupt for a second. So only because I just held this argument on Twitter this morning, I said I'd be wrong if I didn't say it. But for one, as soon as he took office, he tried to undo Obama sanctions on Russia, and Congress immediately put a hold on that and said, absolutely not. You could or pass legislation, I think, within the first 60, 90 days, something like that, saying, no, you absolutely cannot do that. I remember there's only one oligarch in mind that I can think of that as soon as they were put on the sanctions list and their company was hurt, and they complained, he immediately took the person off. And he was accused of, even though on paper, he did ratchet up sanctions pretty heavy on the country, but he was accused of either delaying enforcement of a lot of them, if doing so at all. But I'm open to fact checking some of that. So that's just some of what the counter criticism was. And I can't think. Oh, it was John Bolton, sorry, who was similarly saying that he wasn't as hard as he would like folks to think that he was on Russia. He said that he complained and bitched half of the way every time that was happening. And he's got a long history and friendship with both Putin and the country. So I'd always said that he wasn't going to be, but so heavy on the country.
Well, I think on a broader level, I think we do have to be very careful. There's talk about sending the Polish MiG planes to Ukraine through the American base in Germany,
Right.
Air Base, which is a
Which
NATO base.
I think we said no to that. I don't
And
remember.
we have to be careful because if that plane flies from an American base and then attacks or shoots down
It'll
a
look like
Russian
we
plane or
did it,
attacks
and now we're
one
in
of
the
the
middle of
allied
it, right?
nations, then that is NATO. It's not contorting the truth to say that
Right.
in effect is
Right.
NATO attacking Russians now, rightfully so, et cetera, et cetera.
And then
We do
it'll
have to
be
be careful
clear
about
reason to come back
provocation.
and attack
But there
NATO.
are ways. I read a defense analyst who said, "Look, give the MiGs a new paint job, turn off their electronics so they can't be detected, get some Ukrainian pilots to fly them in directly from Poland in there, and then maybe have American air cover until they hit the Polish border. But you know, there are ways to get those MiGs into Ukraine without embroiling NATO and the
You
United
know what that
States
sounds
in the
like?
fight. I think.
You know what that sounds like? And
Beg your
hopefully,
pardon?
I said, you know what that sounds like? That I hope that we don't have a redo of. We kind of did that with the Bay of Pigs. Remember with repainting planes to look like they weren't ours. And then, they kind of knew about it beforehand, and everyone had already readjusted to
Well,
get out of our way.
those that say that the planes are already on their way, and I would say there's been way too much public discussion of this. We should have just on the, gotten the damn planes in, not talked about it, figured out a plan to get them in there, and not elevated it to a public debate.
You're right. It
But
is a public
those that
debate
say
now. I
that
didn't think
it's
about
just a distraction, and that in effect we actually are getting the planes in, and that either they're already there or they're on their way, and this whole thing is a diversion. So I don't know, but the point is, I do think we can provide. We've been providing military assistance to the Ukrainians since early in the Trump administration. It never started World War III, so that's already that cat is that cow is out of the barn. So as long as we continue, that can work. Remember, a totally different country and totally different situation, but the Taliban in Afghanistan, Mujahideen in Afghanistan, won with a quote inferior military force. They were supplied with American weapons. They were backed by the United States, and they ran the Russians right out of Afghanistan. And it's one reason that the the Soviet Union fell. That was like the final nail in the coffin.
Right.
Was Afghanistan? It was a disgrace. Thousands and thousands of war widows and uh, wives of maimed soldiers.
Their
You couldn't keep
equipment
that
all
quiet.
over the place left.
It spread and it debased what was already a disgraced government in the eyes of most people in the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
That was like the final nail in the coffin. So, we can kind of follow that model. Let's get the javelins and the stingers, and if we can do it in a way that doesn't make it a direct NATO involvement, get the MiGs into Ukraine. Let's do that, and let's coordinate intelligence. Let's be much more aggressive with our cyber warfare. People talk about, well, the Russians are using cyber. We invented cyber. We're in Silicon Valley. The last time I checked, it's not a suburb of Moscow. I think it's a
Right.
suburb of San Francisco, right?
Right.
We invented this technology. We have the greatest computer minds and cyber minds on the planet, or at least I hope we do. And why can't we not only play defense? It isn't just protecting our cyber infrastructure and helping Ukraine protect its cyber infrastructure, but going on offense. If you put your hand down in a hole with a snake in it, trying to grab a snake, he'll bite you. He doesn't just coil up and try to protect himself. You get bit, and we
Right.
need we need an offensive capability. If you mess with the United States or our allies or our partners or our friends on cyber, you're going to get a counterattack, not just defense, not just firewalls, but firestorm, a firestorm of cyber. That needs to be our paradigm in terms of cybersecurity, in my opinion. So I think there's a lot more that we can do. I don't think it, barring the unforeseen and some really, ill-considered actions, is not going to catalyze any kind of World War III. I don't think Putin has any intention of launching ICBMs against the United States or tactical nuclear weapons into Europe, other European countries. Uh, I just don't think that he wants that to happen because I think he wants to win. I think he wants to live and be there to see, this wonderful historic, what he sees as his historic handiwork. I think that's what he wants.
Yes.
Uh, again, I could be wrong. Maybe the man's gone batty. He is, from analysts that I've read and listened to, Putin is surrounded by a lot of people that wouldn't be that unhappy if Russia was isolated. They would rather be rich, powerful people in a country they can control and that they can stabilize than rich, powerful people in a Western integrated country that might be a
Right.
richer country, but also more unstable, and their power and their prestige would be
Right.
much less assured that if the country is isolated and is not interacting on a regular basis with Western countries, Western ideas, Americans, and American ideas. Um, so I think he has people that kind of like the 1950s or maybe the
Hmm.
1970s. They didn't think it was all that bad. It worked
Well,
pretty well for them.
but look, I'll say this. Whether it's the fifties or the 70s of an ideology that's debatable. There's 2 points that I find it's interesting here, regarding being isolated. We won't allow anyone to come and sit at our border. If China went and decided to, line up planes at the Mexico border, we'd probably. I don't think that we would take that so well. And so, the constant push to have Ukraine either to enter NATO or for Ukraine to say, "Hey, let's join the EU." Both of those are signs of westernization that is right next door to Russia that comes across as provoking. And so, that's a part of the conversation that's not talked about as much. Is the constant pushing for Ukraine to be westernized, is it really just a push to provoke Putin? One, and secondly, his claim of denazification. You know, the Ukrainian army has its
With a
that
Jewish president. Let's denazify the country with a Jewish president. That's
right, right.
so that's
But so it does have that. There was that white nationalist group, or what you want to call them, militia, that decided to usurp into the military the Azarov battalion. And so I can't say what percentage that they are of that they are of the military, but to his point, there essentially is a little bit of, some type of neo-Nazi faction within the military. It doesn't mean that the entire thing is, and of course that could be just a ruse as an excuse, to attack next door. But how much credence should be given to that? Do you think that in American media that we just don't want to own up to the fact that we essentially had to pick one side or the other in this? Is it going to be Putin? Is it going to be Ukraine? And they just have a really bad section of their army, and that just wouldn't look nice to be public. And so, in my opinion, I'm looking at this and I feel like his claims of denazification is being loudly denounced, partially, just a little bit, just because we have a little something to do with it. Do you think that there is any credence to that?
well, there's no credence to denazification. That's laughable. Again, Zelensky is Jewish,
Right.
so that kind of evaporates that idiocy right off the bat. But in terms of picking sides, I'll tell you which side I would pick: Ukraine's. And I'm not trying to be simplistic in saying that, but for instance, when you're talking about negotiating with the Russians, you have to look at what the end game is.
Mm-hmm.
Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, has said that if we just told Russia that we would never allow Ukraine into NATO, this never would have happened. We never would have had the invasion, and or he would pull back
Hmm.
right now. I don't think it's that simple. First of all, uh, Putin has abrogated or violated virtually, if not all, virtually every security agreement that his predecessors entered into with the United States and NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. He has violated, thrown into the trash can, ripped apart just about every security agreement. So he's out of compliance with a plethora of security agreements that his predecessors signed on to. So first of all, you don't just say they'll never enter NATO. You say, well, hey, get back into compliance on the agreements that your country entered into and you violated. Let's get that off the table. And then, okay, we can agree that there'll be a neutral country. They will not be in the military alliance NATO, but they may join the EU. EU is an economic alliance. In fact,
Right.
Russia wanted to be in the EU at one point. So, Ukraine being in the EU is, to me, very different from being in NATO. EU is an economic alliance, it's a trade alliance, it is not a military alliance. So, a big difference. So, the point is, we need to look at what the end game is and what we might be able to negotiate with Putin and what we might be able to do to get him that, between the pressure from the Ukrainian military, hopefully much better equipped than the United States than they are currently, between that and what we can negotiate with Putin, or NATO, you know, us and NATO together can negotiate with Putin. we could get him to pull back. Maybe he keeps the Donbass, maybe he keeps certain regions, he keeps Crimea, but most of the country, we should be pushing for it to be free, to be separate, to be to control its own government, not to have a puppet government installed by Russia, obviously. That should be the goal. And again, we can work with Russia on NATO. We have to remember, people say, well, if Ukraine joins NATO, and what Putin said, it's a security threat. If they join NATO, then NATO's
Hmm.
right on the doorstep of Russia. Well, guess what? If he annexes Ukraine, that puts Russia right on the doorstep of NATO. So, that's
Okay.
that's a silly point right there. But when you're negotiating with people, you don't always have to agree with them. You can think that their ideas are crazy or that what they're saying is ludicrous, but you still talk to them. You don't necessarily tell them that to their face. So
Hmm.
I think the end game is probably, I think the desirable end game would be a neutral Ukraine, but a Ukraine that can become more westernized, more integrated with the West on an economic level.
I agree about the
And maybe
neutralizing.
Putin certainly not conquering any more territory than he has. Ideally, would only be, if anything, would only be Crimea, and with him agreeing as part of that construct to get back into compliance with the major security agreements that he's abrogated or violated since he took control of the country.
Okay. And so for the sake of time, last question. Do you think that this is going to be a is do you think that the Ukraine crisis is going to be the possible um, red carpet out for a Trump 2024? Do you think this gives him an edge at all? A lot of people seem to think it is.
You may might give Biden an edge or give
Trump an edge in
Trump.
2024.
I think, look, what I've said, and I could obviously be completely wrong. I don't think Trump is going to run again, and I don't think he will win if he does run. Keep in mind that a majority of Republican voters, and of course, the vast majority of them voted for Trump, but a majority of Republican voters don't want him to run again. I think I think the way it was said best was the late Robert Dole, before he died, said, "I'm pretty much a Trumper. Yeah, I support Trump. But you know what? I'm kind of trumped out." Those were great words. I've never heard anybody else say it that way. And I
That's a good
think a
explanation.
majority of Republican voters, never mind independents and Democrats,
Hmm.
I think a majority of Republican voters are trumped out. They think he was mistreated, and they're right. They think the media was biased against him, and they're right. They think that the wheels of government and our intelligence community were used to try to destroy him, and they're right. They think he had a lot of good ideas, and they're right. He had some bad ones too, and
Hmm.
the way he handled racial issues was among them. Even though he did some great things
Hmm.
legislatively, he had a horrible, horrible way of communicating on race, and his leadership
Yes.
on that was atrocious. But they think he did a lot of good things. They think he was mistreated, et cetera, et cetera. But guess what? They don't want the drama. They're trumped out. They don't want to go back to that. They don't want that man in the news every day or three times a day. Every time he tweets something and becoming a cause
And
celebre.
look,
People
so
don't want
look,
that. I
look,
don't.
even as a supporter, right? Whether it's a business owner, a an elected official, candidate, this is always in the back of your mind because this is kind of hanging over your head. Whatever he just did, depending on the severity of it, can literally be the thing can determine your day, week, month, things of that nature.
And
So,
you know what? I mentioned George Washington thinking, political parties were a scourge and never wanted the United States to have political parties. But another idea that our founders, I think, more or less embraced, while they wanted a well-informed electorate and certainly people to be involved in politics, I mean, we were a government of the people. That's what they built. But they didn't want people to be obsessed with politics. They wanted people to be able to live their lives and go about their day and focus on being a great farmer or being a great shopkeeper or being an inventor and being a good minister, whatever, without having to focus and be obsessed with politics all day, which people in Europe are a lot more. I mean, they talk about politics more than the average American, and they get very heated about it. And so I think Trump, you know, people, obviously people that disagree with Biden, and a lot of Republicans, say bad things about President Biden. But if there's one good thing most people would agree on about President Biden is he's not creating drama every day. He's kind of doing his work, and you may not like some of the work he's
Right.
doing, but irrespective of whether you agree with him or not, the man is not dominating every news cycle. He is not out there aggrandizing himself or attacking individuals by name and saying that that they're contemptible or that they're overrated or whatever term Trump likes to use.
Right.
Um, so again, whether you agree with Biden or not, whether you think he should be president or not, I think that comportment for president is what most Americans want. They want someone that they agree with most of the time and someone
Mm-hmm.
who's competent, but they don't want him constantly in the news. They want him in the news when they do the State of the Union, when
Mm-hmm.
they announce a major legislative program, when there's, God forbid, military action has to be taken, or God forbid, there's a terrorist incident or some horrible domestic happening, a mass shooting. They want that president to comfort us and to talk, but it needs to be selective. Presidential activity should be like picante sauce. It is a flavoring for the food. It is not the soup of the day. Okay, I love picante
Right.
sauce. I will not eat a bowl of picante sauce. I'll put a little bit on my enchiladas or my tacos or my burritos or whatever. That's what I think what people want in a president.
I
A
agree.
concentrated effort, intermittently with nice spaces of relative quietude in between. I think that's what we've always wanted in our presidents. That's what Reagan did. Certainly what Eisenhower did. That's even what Jack Kennedy did. Um, and even Roosevelt was, aware that a president could be overexposed and could be oversaturate the country and and be diminished in terms of his effectiveness as a result. And that was even, he invented the fireside chat and he was ubiquitous on radio. But even Roosevelt measured how much he was out there, and that's something Trump did not do. He had to be in the headlines and he had to be the top of the news cycle all the time, and that's not what Americans want. I don't care what their political
Yeah.
persuasion.
I'll add, we had someone that was in the comment section who has a show called The Fireside Chats that actually appear on every so often. Patrick Ingram, thank you for commenting. And so I had to throw in something just because you mentioned it. About being overexposed and just what essentially some of the problems with the Trump presidency is or was. Can we stop saying that he only sent mean tweets? And I'm hearing this constant refrain that were the tweets that bad now? Do you wish you had them back looking at gas prices? I recall there were a couple policy, things that happened that I think that some of us had the right to disagree with, where it just wasn't mean tweets, I'll add. So I will leave that. I'll leave that alone. I was going to do a tangent, but no, I'm not going to hold you. So Lee, this was a pleasure. Next time, I promise that I'll handle what that tech issue was a little earlier. My apologies, and thanks thanks for
Well, I
those
appreciate
that
you providing my need to change my listening device. But it was a joy being with you as always.
yes. And before we go, could you let everyone know how to find you online?
Yeah, to reach me, the easiest is Twitter, and that's just at Spieckerman, and it's spelled S, as you see on the screen, Spieckerman. But use that same last name. You can find me on IG or on Facebook. I don't think there are any others with that spelling. That will do it. And my YouTube channel, where you can see videos that I've done in the past. IG, I have excerpts from a lot of videos that I've done in the past as well, smaller bites on IG. But again, just look for Speakerman, spell that way. I before E, except after C. Some people really come up with
Very
some
good.
extra letters in there. It makes the long E sound. I-E, C-K, not just K, or just C before the K. Uh, the 11 letters. Remember, if the last name doesn't have 11 letters, you don't have it spelled right.
Uh,
Spieckerman, and I'd love to have you follow me. I always love to hear people's ideas and comments, and so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to provide that information.
Absolutely. All right, and everyone else, you can check me out this Friday. I'll be speaking to Detroit cultural curator Piper Carter this Friday at 3 p.m. And Lee, I want you to hang behind just for a second. I want to play this outro, and I will finish up with you, and we'll just chat for another second.